Hi, welcome to the video lecture on the Enlightenment. Today we're going to take a look at the continued evolution of logical and rational thought as it was soon applied to society. As we take a look at the Enlightenment, the goal of the Enlightenment was to take the ideas and theories of the Age of Reason and to apply those same basic principles to all of society in an attempt to make reason absolute. As we look at the foundation of the Enlightenment, we take a look at the ideas of Sir Isaac Newton and John Locke. Now, these two thinkers' ideas, in particular, had far-reaching ramifications that Newton and Locke never remotely considered in the form of applying science to the ideas of religion. Now, in terms of Newton's theory of gravity, the basic kind of thing that Enlightenment thinkers took away from that theory of gravity was that there was an energy of the universe that motivated and animated everything in the universe and kept it orderly and kept it running. Now, because of that, what began to develop over the course of the Enlightenment was a belief that there was really no place in terms of logical thought for the existence of God or for the supernatural. The same thing is true when we take a look at John Locke. The ideas of the tabula rasa, the blank slate theory, and his explanation that human action was primarily motivated by a desire to do good, kind of removed the idea of a supernatural evil presence, in this case, the Christian, Judeo-Christian concept of the devil. If people were born blank and evil or bad behavior was learned, then in fact there was no real need for a supernatural entity from which all evil sprang. Now, another factor for the Enlightenment in terms of our political thoughts came from the example of England. As England went through that painful process of basically limiting the power of the monarchy and creating a constitutional form of government, that became a shining example for the logical, rational kind of evolution of government, as opposed to the negative examples of France and Spain, in which we had an absolute, as I put it on the outline, an absolute tyranny, in which the monarchies could basically dictate policy, thought, and action. Last but not least, during the Enlightenment, what we really see in terms of economic or cultural growth is we see the emergence of a print culture. And what I mean by that is we see the emergence of documented evidence, books, and pamphlets that are going to push and kind of connect people's ideas around the European continent. In the Enlightenment, we had the creation or the development of a certain group of intellectuals that we call the philosophes, which is French for the word philosopher. Now, the philosophes shared several characteristics. First and foremost, they were anti-religious, they were anti-conservative, and they were liberal politically in terms of being constitutionalists. The individual that kind of took on the role of the father of the Enlightenment was a French thinker / writer by the name of Voltaire. And Voltaire actually created a satire of society that we call Candide. Other thinkers that we can mention, like David Hume and Diderot, were pushing the idea of naturalism, and even to the extent of what Diderot pushed it to say that he could incorporate all of human knowledge in a single book, which he entitled the Encyclopedia. And so what we see as we look at these thinkers and kind of see this intellectual evolution occurring is we see a developing intellectual egotism in which the Enlightenment thinkers believed that they could actually push human understanding into the next frontier, if you will, and create a pure idea of rationalism that would dictate and dominate all, not only philosophical thought, but also all emotional thought as well. What we're going to see, quite interesting enough, is we're actually going to see attempts by philosophical thinkers to create mathematical equations for such things as beauty, love, and kind of connection to humans. It's also during this period that we see really the growth or the birth of what we call the social sciences. Sciences like, of course, psychology and sociology are going to have their roots in this Enlightenment movement, which again is attempting to take reason and apply it to non-scientific or non-traditional scientific avenues, such as the human mind and human emotion. Now, when it comes to religion, all the Enlightenment thinkers, they sought to embrace a more rational religion that we commonly refer to as deism. And the idea behind deism is that in order to increase religious toleration, reduce strife and religious warfare, the Enlightenment thinkers pushed a new definition of God. And that definition is usually kind of defined as a divine watchmaker, an entity that created the universe, got everything started, infused the universe with gravity to help it run properly, and then basically put the universe aside. The universe runs by itself, and now there's no longer a need for this supernatural entity. And so the deists, they believed that it was irrelevant whether you picked a religion, whether you prayed, or whether you conformed to a religious ideology, because in the end, that divine watchmaker did not interfere with his creation or have any additional role in the universe except as the creator. As we continue to take a look, we're going to see the birth of arguably one of the greatest kind of ideas that came out of the Enlightenment, which is the idea of capitalism. Capitalism basically was an intellectual, political, and economic theory in which we have the fundamental shift in terms of how European thinkers and European monarchs viewed the economies of Europe. The book, short in title, The Wealth of Nations, argued, in fact, that contrary to previously held belief, that wealth was, in fact, unlimited. And you could therefore then kind of push the avenues of capital gain well beyond the traditional ideas of everything being based solely on the ideas of gold and silver, which are, as you might expect, limited natural commodities. Adam Smith, the father of capitalism, went on to kind of set up several what he called universal laws of the economic process, one of which kind of was the idea of the law of supply and demand. And Adam Smith argued that much like gravity, supply and demand was a universal force that governed all economic procedures and policies, and that it was completely devoid of human interaction. It could not be changed or basically broken, so to speak, by human activity. And Adam Smith argued that as the basic assumption of capitalism, that the primary motivator of economy was individual self-interest. And as point number 5 mentions, this push for capitalism was the end, if you will, the death of a previous form of economic theory called mercantilism, in which governments sought to increase their wealth by basically hoarding gold and silver and by maximizing exports and minimalizing imports so as to build up that internal treasury. One of the last thinkers of the Enlightenment is a French philosopher by the name of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who argued that things in terms of the government contract, as he called it, the social contract, was in fact a burden upon humanity, but a burden that could not be alleviated because of humans being involved in the political or government evolution of society for such a long time. But he in fact argued that we should abandon or seek hopefully to abandon society eventually and go back to a more primitive, basic state of life in which he called noble savagery, and that people that had less civilization, he argued, were in fact more fundamentally morally noble. And these ideas of Rousseau kind of indicates a transition that was occurring near the end of the Enlightenment, as we saw the pendulum starting to swing back. The Enlightenment thinkers pushed the pendulum far to the area of logic and reasoning, and we start to see that kind of swinging back as people are more embracing traditional ideas, traditional kind of ideas behind emotion and romance. And we call this movement back, this reaction to the Enlightenment, the beginning of the Romantic era. If we take a look at what the Enlightenment, what changes the Enlightenment caused in terms of government theory, we see a string of rulers that we refer to as enlightened despots. And the primary things that the enlightened despots took out of the Enlightenment movement were its emphasis upon public education. The Enlightenment thinkers argued that education should be separated out and be devoid of religious influence. And so we have the birth of public education in a sense. As it exists today, we have that birth of the concept of public education during the Enlightenment period. A lot of governments also took on that idealism or that economic theory of capitalism as a means to maximize income, create larger armies, and create a more substantial power base for the states that would exist. And last but not least, we also have the beginnings of this idea of the separation of church and state being defined logically and philosophically. It had already began, this separation in terms of separating the idea of politics and religion. It had already began in the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation and the religious wars that took place following the Reformation. But it's really during this time we see the fully defined kind of intellectual and philosophical foundation of that theory being discussed and implemented on a government level. Just real quick, just to mention there, Frederick II of Prussia, he was a ruler of the country of Prussia. He was the Kaiser, and he actually went about trying to implement what he felt was most important to maximize his power in terms of his control of the state of Prussia. And that's something we got to mention before we leave the lecture, is that it's important to remember that while we have this massive kind of intellectual movement pushing out, the rulers of Europe were not going to embrace these ideas wholeheartedly because they sought to break down the power of the monarchies. Instead, what we have happening under Frederick II, Maria Theresa, and Catherine the Great is we see a kind of piecemeal implementation of certain Enlightenment theories that would help augment and increase state control of its citizens. And so basically what we have happening as we approach the end of this section 1, which we're going to take a look at in terms of dates from about the late 1500s to about the dawning of the 1800s, the 19th century, what we see is we see an uneven kind of evolution. We see a massive intellectual push to kind of incorporate ideas of the science and reasoning aspect of European society. But at the same time, we see a continuation of the problems or the conflicts developing between religions. And we also see a contrast or an opposition between a rising political ideology that we call constitutionalism and the old kind of political situation of the monarchs holding on to that power in the form of absolutism. And what's going to happen as we approach the 1800s is we're going to see already before the 1800s in the French Revolution, we're going to see these two ideologies clash, and we're going to see kind of what can happen when revolution starts to expand and kind of evolve without any checks and balances. Once again, I thank you for listening to this lecture. I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to speaking to you again in the future. Thank you.